Before there were kings, before there were gods carved in stone, before laws were written and enforced, there was obedience. Not obedience to rulers, not obedience to institutions, but obedience as a condition of survival. This is where the story must begin, because obedience did not enter human life as a moral failure. It entered as a solution, a quiet, almost invisible solution to a problem older than civilization itself. How do fragile beings survive in a dangerous world? For most of human existence, survival depended on coordination. Alone, a human is weak, slow, exposed. But together, humans could hunt animals larger than themselves, defend territory, raise children who required years of care, and survive environments that would otherwise destroy them. Coordination requires alignment. Alignment requires restraint. Restraint requires obedience. Not obedience in the sense of submission to authority, but obedience to shared expectations, to signals, to roles, to the moment. When a hunt begins, someone leads. When danger appears, someone decides. When food is divided, rules are followed. These early forms of obedience were situational, temporary, reversible. They did not belong to individuals, they belonged to moments. If a leader failed, leadership shifted. If a decision proved wrong, it was abandoned. Authority flowed. It did not harden. This flexibility was not ideological, it was practical. Early humans obeyed not because they believed obedience was virtuous, but because disobedience carried immediate costs. A mistimed action could mean death. A refusal to coordinate could endanger everyone. Obedience, in this sense, was not submission, it was synchronization. But synchronization has a consequence. Once a group learns that obedience increases survival, it begins to value obedience beyond the immediate context. It becomes a habit, then an expectation, then a trait that is rewarded, taught, and remembered. Children who followed instructions survived more often. Groups that punished disruptive behavior endured longer. Coordination became culture, and culture shapes psychology. Over generations, humans did not merely learn how to obey, they learned when to obey, whom to obey, and what obedience felt like. This is crucial, because obedience is not only an external behavior, it is an internal orientation, a readiness to align oneself with something larger. Once that readiness exists, it does not disappear when circumstances change. It adapts. As human groups grew larger, obedience changed with them. In small bands, everyone knows everyone else. Social pressure is direct. Reputation matters. Deviance is visible. Correction is personal. But as populations increase, intimacy dissolves. Strangers appear. Memory fades. Direct accountability weakens. Yet coordination is still required. Large groups need obedience more than small ones, but large groups make obedience harder to sustain naturally. You cannot rely on personal bonds when you no longer know who you are obeying. Something else must take their place. This is where obedience begins to detach from immediate necessity and attach itself to abstraction. Commands no longer need to come from someone you trust. They need to come from something you recognize. That recognition can take many forms: a gesture, a title, a ritual, a story. Stories, especially, are powerful. A story does something that no command can do on its own. It makes obedience feel meaningful rather than coerced. It transforms coordination into identity. We do this because it is who we are. We obey because this is our way. We follow because it has always been done. At first, these stories are simple. They explain origins. They justify customs. They stabilize behavior. But stories evolve. As groups settle, as resources accumulate, as conflict emerges within communities rather than between them, obedience must do more than coordinate action. It must regulate inequality.
Inequality does not arise because humans are malicious. It arises because coordination produces surplus, and surplus produces leverage. Someone stores food. Someone controls access. Someone decides distribution. These roles begin as practical necessities. Over time, they harden into positions. Positions invites defense invites justification. Justification invites permanence. At this point, obedience is no longer temporary. It becomes expected even when it no longer benefits everyone equally. This is the moment where obedience stops being purely adaptive and starts becoming structural. And structures do not ask whether they are fair, they ask whether they are stable. Stability requires predictability. Predictability requires compliance. Compliance requires belief. Belief does not need to be true, it needs to be shared. There is something even more fundamental than belief. There is fear. Fear of exclusion, fear of punishment, fear of chaos. Humans fear disorder because disorder threatens survival. A fractured group is a vulnerable group. A divided community collapses under pressure. This fear makes obedience emotionally compelling. To obey is to belong. To disobey is to risk isolation. Over time, this emotional calculus becomes internalized. People police themselves. They feel guilt not because they have done harm, but because they have violated expectation. This is one of the most profound psychological transformations in human history. Obedience no longer requires constant enforcement. It becomes self-sustaining. Once this happens, power no longer needs to rely solely on force. It can rely on conscience. Conscience, however, is not universal. It is trained. Different societies train obedience differently. Some emphasize loyalty. Some emphasize fear. Some emphasize honor. Some emphasize divine judgment. But the underlying mechanism is the same. Obedience is taught early, reinforced often, and rarely questioned. Not because questioning is impossible, but because questioning threatens belonging. This is why obedience persists even when it produces suffering. A system that distributes pain unequally can survive if it distributes meaning convincingly. If suffering is framed as necessary, deserved, temporary, or sacred, obedience endures. This explains why civilizations do not collapse the moment they become unjust. They collapse when obedience loses its justification. Kings are only effective if people are prepared to obey them. Gods are only powerful if people believe they must obey them. Laws only function if obedience is habitual. Obedience is the foundation. Everything else is architecture built on top of it. And once that foundation is laid, it can support extraordinary structures.
It can support empires. It can support slavery. It can support monumental inequality. It can also support stability, continuity, and collective achievement. Obedience is not evil, but it is dangerous, because obedience, once normalized, does not ask what it serves. It asks only whether it is expected. This is the condition that makes civilization possible and fragile. And it is from this condition that everything else emerges. As human groups grew larger and more settled, obedience encountered a new problem. Instinct was no longer enough. In small groups, coordination happens naturally. People see one another. They read faces, gestures, tone. Authority is negotiated moment by moment. A skilled hunter leads the hunt. An experienced elder guides decisions. Leadership is temporary and contextual. But when populations expand beyond memory, visibility fades. You cannot negotiate with hundreds of people at once. You cannot explain every decision. You cannot rely on personal trust when strangers surround you. Yet coordination is still required. Crops must be planted at the right time. Irrigation must be maintained. Storage must be protected. Conflict must be resolved. This is the moment where obedience must become predictable. Predictability requires rules.
Rules are different from commands. A command addresses a moment. A rule addresses the future. It tells people what will happen before it happens. Rules remove uncertainty, and uncertainty is dangerous in dense societies. The earliest rules were not moral, they were procedural. They did not ask what was right, they asked what was stable. If a boundary is crossed, there is a consequence. If a debt is unpaid, there is a penalty. If an order is ignored, there is a response. Once consequences are known, behavior adjusts. This is how law begins, not as justice, but as expectation. Law does not require people to agree. It requires them to anticipate. Anticipation reduces conflict. Conflict drains resources. Law conserves energy. In early river civilizations, where agriculture depended on collective labor, law became indispensable. Floods do not wait for debate. Canals collapse if neglected. Storage fails if mismanaged. Someone had to decide who worked, when, and how much. At first, this authority belonged to those closest to coordination: administrators of grain, organizers of labor, record keepers. Their power was practical, but practicality attracts permanence. Once a system works, it resists change. Those who manage resources begin to define access. Those who define access begin to define behavior. Those who define behavior begin to define legitimacy. Law expands. What began as regulation of labor becomes regulation of life. Marriage, inheritance, punishment, status. The law begins to describe not only what people do, but who people are. This transformation is subtle but decisive. When identity becomes legal, obedience becomes structural. You are no longer obeying a person, you are obeying a category. Free or enslaved, citizen or outsider, elite or commoner. These distinctions are not natural, they are enforced. But once enforced consistently, they feel inevitable. Law teaches people where they belong. This belonging is not emotional, it is administrative. And administration has a particular kind of power. It does not need to persuade. It does not need to threaten constantly. It only needs to function. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest written laws make this explicit. Punishments differ by status. Harm is not measured by suffering, but by rank. The same act carries different consequences depending on who commits it and who receives it. This is not hypocrisy, it is clarity. Clarity is calming in unstable societies. People may resent inequality, but they fear unpredictability more. Law offers a bargain. Accept your place and you will know what to expect. This bargain works for a time. But law alone cannot sustain obedience indefinitely. Rules require enforcement. Enforcement requires authority. Authority requires justification. Why should these rules be followed? Why should these penalties be accepted? Why should hierarchy be obeyed? At first, the answer is force. Disobedience is punished visibly. Compliance is rewarded. Fear does the work belief has not yet completed. But fear is expensive. It must be renewed constantly. It breeds resentment. It invites resistance. A more durable solution is needed. This is where obedience seeks legitimacy beyond practicality. And this is where the sacred enters. When rules are framed as human decisions, they can be questioned. When they are framed as reflections of cosmic order, they cannot. A law backed by force controls behavior. A law backed by meaning controls conscience. This transition is one of the most important moments in human history. Obedience begins to feel righteous, not merely necessary, not merely unavoidable, but correct. When obedience aligns with the structure of the universe itself, disobedience becomes more than a crime. It becomes a violation of reality. This is how gods become political, not as explanations of nature, but as guarantors of order. The divine does not enter human societies to explain floods or droughts. Those explanations already exist in experience. The divine enters to explain hierarchy, why one person commands and another obeys, why inequality persists, why suffering is tolerated. When authority is aligned with the sacred, obedience acquires depth. You are no longer obeying because you must, you are obeying because it is right. And once obedience feels right, it becomes resilient. It survives famine, it survives war, it survives injustice. This is the architecture being built. Law provides structure, belief provides legitimacy, obedience binds them together. From this point forward, civilizations will differ in form, but not in foundation. Some will elevate kings to gods. Some will bind rulers to divine law. Some will embed authority in ritual rather than individuals. But all will rely on the same psychological groundwork. A population trained to obey before it is trained to question. And once that training is complete, power can scale. It can extend across cities, across regions, across generations, because obedience, once normalized, does not require constant reinforcement. It only requires continuity.
As obedience becomes embedded in law and sanctified by belief, power discovers something profound. It can outlive the individuals who hold it. In earlier forms of authority, leadership ended with the leader. Influence faded when memory faded. But once obedience is tied to something beyond the human, to the sacred, to cosmic order, to eternity, power acquires duration. It becomes timeless. This transformation changes everything. When authority claims permanence, it no longer presents itself as a temporary arrangement. It presents itself as the natural state of the world. The ruler does not govern. The ruler embodies order. This is the moment where kingship becomes divine, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but structurally. In societies along great rivers, where agriculture depended on cycles larger than any human life, this idea felt intuitive. The flood returns, the sun rises, seasons repeat. Continuity becomes sacred. If nature obeys order, society must as well. The king becomes the axis between worlds. He does not merely command labor, he ensures balance. He mediates between heaven and earth. His authority is no longer judged by success alone, but by alignment. Alignment with the gods, alignment with the cosmos, alignment with eternity. This reframing is powerful. If a ruler fails, the failure is not political, it is moral. If suffering occurs, it is not injustice, it is imbalance. Responsibility shifts. The population no longer evaluates power, it endures it. This is how obedience deepens. When authority is eternal, resistance feels futile. When hierarchy reflects the structure of reality itself, disobedience feels unnatural. In Egypt, this logic reached its purest form. The pharaoh was not chosen by gods, he was divine by nature. His body carried order, his presence sustained harmony. To obey him was not submission, it was participation in cosmic stability. Even death did not interrupt this structure. Obedience extended beyond life. The afterlife mirrored the world of the living. Hierarchy persisted, judgment awaited, order continued. This is a crucial shift. Power now governs not only behavior, but destiny. If obedience determines one's fate beyond death, then resistance risks eternity. This does not require constant enforcement, it requires belief.
Belief, once internalized, becomes more efficient than violence. People police themselves, they discipline their desires, they align their lives with expectation. This is not because they are weak, it is because meaning has been engineered. Power no longer needs to justify inequality. Inequality has become sacred. Yet even here, obedience is not total. Humans still observe, they still compare, they still notice contradiction. When floods fail, when harvests collapse, when rulers grow distant, belief does not disappear, it adjusts. Rituals increase, explanations multiply, priesthoods grow. Authority responds not by surrendering power, but by deepening symbolism. The system becomes more elaborate as it becomes more fragile. This pattern repeats across civilizations. Divinity protects power until reality challenges it. Elsewhere, different arrangements emerge. In the Indus Valley, order appears without visible kings. Cities are planned, infrastructure is maintained, standards are shared. Authority is present but hidden. Obedience exists without spectacle. This suggests something unsettling. Power does not always need gods or kings to function. It needs coordination. It needs norms. It needs acceptance. The absence of visible rulers does not eliminate hierarchy. It conceals it. In China, power takes another form. Heaven grants authority, but conditionally. The ruler is not divine. He is accountable. If order fails, legitimacy dissolves. This creates a subtle but important distinction. Obedience remains strong, but it is no longer absolute. Morality enters governance. Power must perform virtue. Yet even here, the structure holds. Obedience is not optional. It is contextual. Across these systems, one truth becomes clear. Obedience adapts. It can attach itself to gods. It can attach itself to law. It can attach itself to order itself. What matters is not the justification, but the habit. Once obedience becomes habitual, power becomes scalable. It extends across generations, across territories, across beliefs, and it becomes difficult to dismantle. Because obedience does not announce itself as domination, it presents itself as normal. This is the quiet triumph of early civilization. Power no longer needs to conquer constantly. It needs only to continue. And continuity, once achieved, resists disruption. Yet beneath this stability, something begins to stir. If obedience can be justified in so many ways, perhaps it is not inevitable. If power can change its form, perhaps it can be questioned. This realization does not erupt immediately. It waits, embedded in contradiction, preserved in memory, carried quietly forward. Because once humans learn to obey systems rather than individuals, they also learn something else. Systems can be examined, and examination, eventually, leads to doubt.
As power stretches across generations, obedience encounters a paradox. The very mechanisms that stabilize society also make it rigid. Continuity preserves order, but it resists correction. What was once adaptive becomes habitual. What was once justified becomes unquestioned. Civilizations now carry memory. They remember victories. They remember rituals. They remember hierarchies. Memory gives power depth. But memory also preserves error. When obedience is transmitted across generations, it is no longer evaluated by experience alone. It is inherited. Children are born into systems they did not choose. They learn roles before they learn reasons. They accept structures before they understand alternatives. This is not indoctrination in the modern sense. It is environment.
A child raised within hierarchy does not perceive hierarchy as imposed. It feels natural. This is one of the most powerful features of obedience. It disguises itself as reality. As societies mature, this disguise becomes more elaborate. Institutions emerge to preserve continuity, priesthoods, bureaucracies, traditions. Each claims stewardship rather than control. They do not say, obey us. They say, this is how things are. Obedience becomes invisible. This invisibility allows power to persist without constant enforcement. Yet it also creates distance. Those who rule no longer experience the consequences of their decisions directly. Those who obey no longer see the origins of the rules they follow. A gap opens. This gap is filled with interpretation. Stories are refined. Symbols are multiplied. Rituals become more complex. Complexity creates reverence. Reverence discourages scrutiny. But complexity also introduces fragility. The more layers a system has, the more places it can fail. Failures do not immediately destroy belief. They create tension. When crops fail, explanations are offered. When wars are lost, meanings are reassigned. When injustice becomes visible, it is reframed as necessity. Obedience persists because it adapts, but adaptation has limits. As trade expands and cultures encounter one another, comparison becomes unavoidable. People notice that other societies obey differently, that other gods demand different rituals, that other laws produce different outcomes. This comparison is destabilizing. If obedience were truly absolute, it would not vary. Variation implies contingency. This realization does not immediately produce rebellion, it produces curiosity. Curiosity is quieter than defiance, but it is more dangerous. Curiosity asks why without demanding change. It observes, it remembers, it connects. Across civilizations, moments of comparison accumulate. Merchants travel, stories spread, ideas cross boundaries. No system remains isolated forever. As contact increases, authority must explain difference. Why do they live differently? Why do their gods behave differently? Why does their obedience take another form? Answers are provided, often confidently, sometimes aggressively. But repetition reveals inconsistency. Over time, obedience encounters contradiction. Contradiction does not break systems instantly. It weakens their inevitability. Once inevitability fades, obedience requires reinforcement. This reinforcement can take two paths. One path tightens control. Punishment intensifies. Dissent is suppressed. The other path absorbs doubt. Interpretations evolve. Exceptions are permitted. Civilizations oscillate between these responses. Neither is permanent. Rigid systems shatter. Flexible systems drift. This instability does not signal collapse, it signals transformation. As obedience becomes more conscious, it begins to change character. People still obey, but they notice themselves obeying. This self-awareness is subtle. It does not announce itself. It emerges in questions whispered rather than shouted. Why this rule? Why this hierarchy? Why this suffering? At first, such questions are internal. Then they are shared privately. Eventually, they surface publicly. Power responds, sometimes by reform, sometimes by repression, often by a mixture of both. But the act of questioning cannot be reversed. Once obedience is seen as learned rather than natural, it becomes examinable. And what can be examined can be altered. This does not mean obedience disappears. It means it becomes conditional. Conditional obedience is fragile, but it is also adaptive. Civilization enters a new phase. Stability is no longer guaranteed by permanence alone. It must be maintained through justification. Justification invites debate. Debate invites reason, invites comparison. The cycle accelerates. Belief systems that once unified begin to fragment. Authority must negotiate rather than command. Law becomes subject to interpretation. This transition is uneven, often violent, always contested. Yet it marks a fundamental shift. Obedience is no longer silent, it is aware. And awareness, once present, reshapes everything. Because obedience that knows itself is no longer merely survival. It becomes choice.
As awareness spreads, obedience enters its most delicate phase. It has not disappeared, it has not collapsed, but it has begun to hesitate. For the first time, people are not only obeying systems, they are thinking about them. This shift does not originate in rebellion, it originates in reflection. Reflection emerges when survival no longer consumes every moment, when time exists to observe rather than react, when patterns can be noticed across generations. As societies grow wealthier and more complex, a small but influential portion of the population gains access to this time. They are not necessarily rulers. Often they are priests, scribes, merchants, or teachers. Their power is not coercive, it is interpretive. They begin to notice that obedience produces mixed outcomes, that order brings stability, but also stagnation, that hierarchy coordinates effort, but also concentrates suffering. These observations accumulate quietly. They are discussed in private, recorded in texts, passed through instruction. This is how thought begins to separate from authority. In earlier systems, meaning flowed downward, from gods to kings, from kings to laws, from laws to people. Now, meaning begins to circulate. Ideas are compared, arguments are refined, contradictions are noted. Philosophy emerges not as an attack on obedience, but as an attempt to understand it. What makes a rule legitimate? When is authority justified? Is obedience virtuous or merely convenient? These questions are destabilizing because they treat obedience as a problem to be examined rather than a fact to be accepted. Reason enters the structure. Reason is different from belief. Belief demands alignment. Reason demands coherence. Belief tolerates contradiction if it preserves meaning. Reason exposes contradiction as a flaw. This difference matters. Once reason is applied to authority, authority must respond. Sometimes it adapts, sometimes it resists. Often it does both simultaneously. In some societies, reason is integrated carefully. Debate is permitted within boundaries. Interpretation is encouraged, but conclusions are constrained. In others, reason is viewed as a threat. Inquiry is restricted. Dissent is punished. These responses shape trajectories. Where reason is absorbed, obedience transforms. Where it is suppressed, obedience hardens. Neither outcome is permanent. Reason spreads through contact. Trade carries goods, but it also carries ideas. Conquest imposes power, but it also exposes difference. Migration blends customs and beliefs. No civilization remains intellectually isolated. As ideas circulate, obedience encounters alternatives. People learn that laws can be written differently, that authority can be justified differently, that order can exist without the same hierarchies. This knowledge does not immediately liberate. Its destabilization produces anxiety. Anxiety produces reaction. Some cling tighter to tradition. Others experiment cautiously. Most oscillate between comfort and curiosity. This tension reshapes institutions. Law becomes debated. Belief becomes interpreted.
Power becomes negotiated. None of this eliminates obedience. It reframes it. Obedience becomes conditional, contextual, justified rather than assumed. This conditionality changes the emotional tone of societies. Fear recedes slightly. Responsibility increases. People begin to see themselves not only as subjects, but as participants. Participation requires judgment. Judgment requires standards. Standards require reason. The cycle reinforces itself. Yet this transition is costly. Certainty dissolves. Unity fractures. Conflict increases. When shared belief weakens, coordination becomes harder. When authority is questioned, enforcement intensifies. When meaning fragments, violence often follows. This is not failure, it is transformation. Civilizations rarely move forward peacefully. They move forward through tension. The struggle between obedience and reason reshapes power. Rulers learn they must persuade, not only command. Institutions learn they must explain, not only enforce. Belief systems learn they must interpret, not only declare. This does not eliminate hierarchy, it reframes it. Hierarchy becomes functional rather than sacred. Authority becomes provisional rather than eternal. This is fragile. Provisional systems can fail. Functional hierarchies can collapse, but they can also adapt. Adaptation becomes the new source of stability. Societies begin to value flexibility alongside order, correction alongside continuity, debate alongside obedience. This balance is never resolved. It must be maintained. The cost of maintenance is vigilance. People must pay attention. They must notice when obedience exceeds justification. They must resist the comfort of certainty when it hardens into domination. This is not a natural instinct. It must be learned. And learning is uneven. Some societies advance quickly. Others resist change. Many regress. History does not move in a straight line. But once reason enters obedience, it can never be removed. The memory remains. That memory waits for conditions to align. Because obedience that has been examined can never return fully to innocence. It will always remember that it could have been otherwise. And that memory, quietly, reshapes the future.
As obedience becomes conditional, another force enters the center of human life. Voice. For most of civilization, voice existed, but it was constrained. People spoke within roles, within rituals, within expectations. Speech affirmed order more often than it challenged it. Words praised rulers. Words repeated laws. Words explained suffering. Speech functioned as reinforcement. But once reason spreads, speech begins to change its role. It no longer only reflects power, it begins to test it. This shift does not occur because people suddenly value freedom. It occurs because coordination in complex societies now depends on information rather than command alone. As systems grow larger, rulers cannot see everything. Administrators rely on reports. Judges rely on testimony. Markets rely on communication. Silencing voice entirely becomes impractical. At the same time, unrestrained speech feels dangerous. Speech can reveal contradiction. It can expose abuse. It can mobilize resentment. Power faces a dilemma. It needs speech to function. It fears speech because it can destabilize. This tension shapes the next phase of obedience. In earlier societies, dissent was treated as defiance. Now it becomes ambiguity. Not every critical word is rebellion. Not every question is a threat. Some speech improves systems. Some speech corrodes them. Distinguishing between the two becomes one of the most difficult tasks of governance.
Authority experiments. Some societies permit limited speech within designated spaces, debate halls, courts, assemblies. Speech is allowed, but contained. Other societies regulate speech through taboo. Certain topics are avoided. Certain words are forbidden. Silence becomes a form of obedience. Both approaches share a goal: control expression without extinguishing function. This is not censorship in the modern sense, it is calibration. Speech is managed like a resource. Too little, and systems blind themselves. Too much, and cohesion fractures. The challenge is balance. In places where public debate emerges, something remarkable happens. Power becomes visible. Arguments reveal assumptions. Counterarguments reveal weakness. Authority is forced to explain itself. Explanation changes relationships, and command ends conversation, and explanation invites response. Once response is possible, obedience transforms again. People do not simply comply, they evaluate. This evaluation does not make societies peaceful, it makes them dynamic. Conflict shifts from physical to verbal. Violence does not disappear, but it competes with persuasion. Persuasion rewards skill, distributes influence. Influence is no longer tied solely to position. It can be earned through speech. This redistributes power unevenly. Those trained in rhetoric gain advantage. Those excluded from education fall behind. Speech becomes a new hierarchy. Freedom of expression does not eliminate inequality, it rearranges it. Yet even this rearrangement weakens absolute authority. No single narrative can dominate unchallenged. No explanation remains final. Power adapts by shaping discourse. Institutions define acceptable arguments. Traditions define respectable opinions. Custom defines tone. Speech becomes regulated socially rather than violently. This regulation is subtle. It feels voluntary. It feels normal. People censor themselves before being censored. This internalization mirrors earlier forms of obedience. The difference is awareness. People now know that silence is chosen. This knowledge matters because choice implies responsibility. Once individuals recognize that their voice can shape systems, withholding it becomes a decision rather than a condition. This creates moral tension. Is silence complicity? Is speech obligation? Is dissent virtue or disruption? Societies struggle with these questions. They do not resolve them, they manage them. Moments of expansion follow moments of repression. Periods of openness alternate with periods of control. History oscillates. But something irreversible has occurred. Speech has become a site of power. Power is no longer exercised only through force, law, or belief. It is exercised through narratives. Who defines reality? Who frames events? Who names injustice? These questions shape obedience more subtly than commands ever could. People obey not only rules, they obey stories. Stories about danger, stories about order, stories about identity. When speech is free enough to circulate, competing stories emerge. Some unify, some divide. Authority attempts to privilege certain stories over others. This privileging rarely announces itself. It appears as common sense, as tradition, as responsibility. But over time, inconsistencies accumulate. Voices excluded from official narratives persist, whispered, mocked, marginalized, but not erased. As literacy spreads, voice detaches from presence. Words travel, texts endure, ideas outlive speakers. Control becomes harder. A spoken challenge can be silenced, a written one can be rediscovered. This durability of expression changes the balance. Obedience now contends with not only living dissent, but with preserved dissent. The past speaks, and the past does not always agree with the present. This creates lineage. Thinkers respond to earlier thinkers. Critics cite predecessors. Arguments evolve. Obedience encounters memory armed with reason. At this point, suppression becomes counterproductive. Attempts to silence speech draw attention. Punishment amplifies the message. Martyrdom transforms dissent into meaning. Power learns caution. It tolerates limited opposition. It incorporates criticism. It reforms selectively. Not out of benevolence, out of survival. Because systems that cannot absorb dissent eventually shatter. This does not mean freedom triumphs. It means obedience becomes negotiated. Speech becomes a pressure valve, a diagnostic tool, a threat. Societies that manage this tension persist. Those that fail oscillate violently. This struggle does not end. It intensifies. Because as communication accelerates, so does coordination. Voice connects strangers. Ideas synchronize movements. Words mobilize action. Speech, once individual, becomes collective. Collective voice challenges authority in new ways. It can organize without leaders. It can resist without armies. It can persist without permission. Power responds by redefining legitimacy. Some voices are labeled dangerous, others irresponsible, others foreign. These labels justify control, but labeling reveals fear. Fear signals vulnerability. When power fears speech, it reveals dependence. Dependence on belief, dependence on consent, dependence on obedience. This dependence marks a turning point. Obedience is no longer absolute. It is relational. It exists within dialogue, within contest, within tension. Civilization enters a phase where silence and speech are both political. To speak is to risk. To remain silent is to choose. Neither is neutral. This is the burden of awareness, and it reshapes the future. Because a society that has learned to speak cannot be governed as if it were mute, and a population that knows its voice can never fully forget it.
As collective voice grows louder, another concept rises alongside it. Liberty. Not as an ideal, not as a promise, but as a problem. Liberty emerges when obedience can no longer be assumed. In earlier worlds, freedom was not debated because it was scarce. Survival left little space for choice. Roles were inherited. Lives were constrained. Stability mattered more than autonomy. But as societies learn to organize without constant force, as speech circulates and systems adapt, space opens. Within that space, people begin to ask a new question. If obedience is conditional, then what is optional? Liberty does not arrive as a gift from power. It appears as a consequence of limitation. When authority can no longer see everything, enforce everything, or justify everything, it must tolerate gaps. Those gaps become freedoms. At first, liberty is narrow. Freedom to trade, freedom to travel, freedom to worship differently, freedom to speak cautiously. Each freedom exists within constraint. Each can be revoked. This provisional nature shapes liberty's character. Liberty is not celebrated, it is negotiated. Power tests boundaries. Populations test tolerance. Both sides learn. Authority learns that suppressing every deviation is exhausting. People learn that pushing too far invites punishment. A fragile equilibrium forms. Liberty becomes defined not by absence of control, but by limits on control. This reframing is subtle. It does not eliminate hierarchy, it reorganizes it. Power still exists, but it must justify intervention.
Justification introduces standards. Standards can be contested. This is the core tension. Once liberty exists, obedience must explain itself. Why obey here but not there? Why submit now but resist later? Why accept some commands and reject others? These questions force societies to articulate values. Values had previously been implicit. Now they must be named. Security, order, prosperity, faith, tradition, liberty competes with each of them, not as an enemy, as a constraint. Too much liberty destabilizes coordination. Too little suffocates adaptation. The balance is difficult. Some societies resolve this tension by codifying liberty. Rights are defined, boundaries are written, protections are declared. This formalization gives liberty durability, but it also creates rigidity. Written freedoms must be interpreted. Interpretation invites dispute. Dispute invites power. Institutions arise to manage liberty. Courts, assemblies, councils. These bodies do not eliminate conflict, they structure it. Conflict becomes procedural. This is an achievement. Violence recedes slightly. Argument advances. But procedure has limits. Those with access to institutions gain advantage. Those without voice remain constrained. Liberty spreads unevenly. Some are free, others are managed. This unevenness creates contradiction. Liberty proclaimed universally but practiced selectively erodes legitimacy. People notice. They compare promise to reality. Comparison fuels pressure. Pressure demands response. Power responds by redefining liberty. Freedom becomes framed as responsibility. Speech becomes framed as duty. Dissent becomes framed as threat. These framings are not lies, they are partial truths. Liberty does carry risk. Speech can harm. Dissent can fracture cohesion. But framing emphasizes danger to justify restraint. This justification often succeeds. People trade liberty for stability. They accept limits in exchange for security. This trade feels rational. It feels adult. Yet each trade shifts the boundary. Over time, liberty narrows, then expands, then narrows again. This oscillation defines modern governance. There is no final equilibrium. Liberty is not a destination. It is a condition to be maintained. Maintenance requires vigilance. Vigilance is tiring. Populations oscillate between engagement and apathy, between resistance and resignation. Authority adapts to these cycles. It loosens control when pressure rises. It tightens control when attention fades. This rhythm becomes familiar. Liberty survives not because it is sacred, but because it is useful. It allows innovation. It absorbs dissent. It reduces the cost of enforcement. But it also introduces unpredictability. Unpredictability threatens systems designed for continuity. The tension persists. As communication accelerates further, liberty encounters a new scale. Individual freedoms aggregate. Small expressions combine into movements. Local dissent becomes global discourse. Liberty amplifies itself. This amplification changes its character. What was once personal becomes political. What was once private becomes visible. Authority struggles to respond. Old tools feel inadequate. New tools feel invasive. Surveillance expands. Regulation adapts. Narratives intensify. Liberty becomes entangled with technology. This entanglement is unresolved. Tools that empower voice also enable control. Platforms that connect also monitor. Freedom and constraint advance together. This is not a betrayal of liberty. It is its modern condition. Liberty exists within systems it cannot escape. Yet despite this entanglement, something remains. The memory of choice. the experience of speaking, the knowledge that obedience is not inevitable. This knowledge alters obedience permanently. Even when liberty contracts, it leaves residue. People remember when they could speak. They remember when dissent mattered. They remember alternatives. Memory becomes resistance. Resistance does not always manifest as protest. Sometimes it manifests as skepticism, as withdrawal, as refusal to believe fully. This quiet resistance shapes the future, because obedience that has known liberty can never return to unquestioned submission. It may comply, it may conform, but it will always hesitate. And hesitation, multiplied across millions, reshapes power.
As societies grow larger and more complex, obedience changes its texture. It becomes quieter. In earlier worlds, power was visible. Rulers were known. Laws were announced. Punishment was public. Obedience was demanded face to face, reinforced by ritual and spectacle. In modern mass societies, power recedes from view. It operates through systems. Bureaucracy replaces command. Procedure replaces judgment. Process replaces presence. This transformation feels less oppressive. It also feels less human. When authority is embodied in a person, it can be confronted. When authority is embodied in a system, it becomes diffuse. Who is responsible? Who decides? Who can be challenged? The answers blur. Obedience adapts. People follow instructions not because they believe in them, but because they are embedded in routines. Forms are filled, steps are followed, protocols are obeyed. Compliance becomes procedural. This procedural obedience is efficient. It is also alienating. Individuals no longer feel dominated, they feel managed. Management does not demand loyalty, it demands correctness. You are not asked to believe, you are asked to comply. This shift lowers emotional resistance. It also lowers moral engagement. When actions are fragmented across systems, responsibility dissolves. Each person performs a small task. No one sees the whole. This fragmentation makes large-scale harm possible without malicious intent. Obedience no longer requires belief. It requires detachment. Detachment is powerful. It allows people to participate in systems whose outcomes they would reject if faced directly. This is not cruelty, it is distance. Distance dulls conscience. Bureaucratic obedience thrives on neutrality, on the idea that rules are impersonal, that outcomes are unintended. But unintended does not mean harmless. As systems expand, consequences scale. Decisions made far from impact affect millions. Algorithms allocate resources. Policies shape lives. Yet responsibility remains abstract. This abstraction stabilizes power. People feel powerless not because force is overwhelming, but because accountability is elusive. Resistance becomes difficult. Who do you oppose? A policy? A process? A system that claims neutrality? Power hides behind procedure. This does not eliminate dissent, it transforms it. Anger turns inward. Frustration becomes apathy. Critique becomes cynicism. Cynicism is obedience's quiet companion. It allows compliance without belief, participation without faith. People stop expecting systems to be just. They expect them to function. This expectation is modest. It is also dangerous. When functionality replaces justice as the standard, abuse can persist indefinitely. As long as systems work, suffering is tolerated. This tolerance is reinforced by complexity. Complex systems feel inevitable, too large to change, too interconnected to challenge. Obedience aligns with resignation. Yet even here, awareness persists. People sense the gap between procedure and morality.
between efficiency and humanity. This gap produces unease. Unease does not always produce action. Sometimes it produces withdrawal. Withdrawal weakens collective voice. Fragmentation returns. Power adapts again. It offers participation without influence, choice without consequence, engagement without agency. Surveys, feedback, representation. These mechanisms absorb dissatisfaction. They create the feeling of voice without altering structure. This containment is effective. People feel heard, systems remain unchanged. Obedience stabilizes. Yet stability is fragile, because beneath procedural calm, memory remains. People remember moments when systems failed catastrophically, when neutrality masked cruelty, when obedience enabled disaster. These memories resurface. They disrupt complacency. They fuel skepticism. Cynicism spreads quietly. It does not shout, it doubts. Doubt weakens legitimacy. Legitimacy is essential for large systems. Force alone cannot sustain scale. Power responds by emphasizing trust, transparency, expertise. Experts replace rulers. Data replaces decree. This shift is rational. It is also political. Expertise commands obedience by claiming objectivity. Disagreement becomes ignorance. Critique becomes irresponsibility. This framing restores authority, but it introduces a new vulnerability. Experts can be wrong. Data can mislead. Models can fail. When failure occurs, trust erodes rapidly. Unlike divine or traditional authority, technical authority depends on performance. Performance creates fragility. Each failure invites scrutiny. Each correction exposes uncertainty. Uncertainty undermines obedience. People begin to ask whether systems truly know what they are doing, whether compliance is justified. These questions echo earlier doubts, but at greater scale. Once again, obedience confronts its limits, and once again, the response is adaptation. Systems adjust, narratives shift, controls tighten subtly, but the core tension remains. Obedience has become impersonal, power has become abstract, responsibility has become diffuse. This configuration is efficient, it is also brittle. When it breaks widely. The future will be shaped by how societies resolve this tension, whether obedience continues to fragment responsibility, or whether new forms of accountability emerge. The answer is not yet written, but the conditions are already visible. A world where power is everywhere and nowhere, where obedience is routine, where resistance is difficult but not impossible, and where awareness, once again, waits beneath the surface. Because systems can dull conscience, but they cannot erase it. Not entirely.
There is a temptation, when tracing the history of obedience, to imagine an endpoint, a moment where systems finally align with conscience, where power becomes transparent, where freedom and order coexist without tension. History offers no evidence for this ending. What it offers instead is a pattern. Obedience does not disappear, it transforms. Each transformation solved one problem while creating another. Each expansion of freedom introduces new vulnerabilities. Each refinement of control produces new blind spots. Civilization advances not by resolving this tension, but by renegotiating it. The future will be no different. If anything, the pace of change accelerates the problem. Systems grow faster than understanding. Decisions scale beyond intuition. Power concentrates through abstraction while appearing decentralized. Responsibility disperses even as impact intensifies. Obedience adapts once again, not through fear alone, not through belief alone, not through law alone, but through convenience. The most effective systems of the future will not demand obedience. They will offer it as the path of least resistance. Interfaces will guide behavior. Defaults will shape choice. Algorithms will suggest rather than command. Participation will feel voluntary, even when outcomes are predetermined. This is not tyranny in its old form. It is alignment. People will not be forced to obey. They will be nudged, optimized, sorted, predicted. The language of control will soften. Efficiency, personalization, security, well-being. Each term contains truth. Each can be used to justify restraint. This does not mean resistance becomes impossible. It means resistance becomes harder to recognize. When power feels helpful, opposing it feels irrational. When systems appear neutral, challenging them feels futile. When obedience is embedded in convenience, refusal feels costly. The danger is not domination, it is drift. Drift allows systems to move without scrutiny. It allows small concessions to accumulate into irreversible change. It allows obedience to expand without ever being declared. Yet history suggests something enduring. Humans notice when the gap between meaning and mechanism grows too wide. They notice when efficiency replaces dignity, when optimization replaces judgment, when convenience replaces choice. This noticing does not always produce revolt. Often it produces reflection. Reflection is slow. It does not trend. It does not mobilize instantly. But reflection shapes values. Values shape expectations. Expectations shape legitimacy. Legitimacy remains the fragile core of obedience. No system, however advanced, can function indefinitely without it. Force is expensive. Surveillance is brittle. Manipulation erodes trust. Eventually, systems must answer to those who live within them. The question is not whether obedience will exist. It will. The question is whether obedience will be conscious, whether individuals will recognize when they are aligning out of agreement and when they are aligning out of inertia, whether silence will be chosen thoughtfully or assumed automatically, whether participation will be deliberate or habitual. The future depends less on freedom as a slogan than on awareness as a practice. Awareness does not guarantee justice, but without it, injustice becomes invisible. Awareness requires effort. It requires education that teaches how systems work, not merely how to function within them. It requires public discourse that tolerates discomfort. It requires institutions willing to expose their own limits. These conditions are rare. They are also renewable. Each generation must reconstruct them. History shows that progress is not inherited intact. It is reconstructed imperfectly. Gains are preserved only when they are understood. When understanding fades, obedience reverts, not dramatically, quietly. The lesson is not despair, it is responsibility. Obedience is unavoidable in complex societies. Coordination requires alignment. Alignment requires restraint. But obedience need not be blind. It can be informed. It can be conditional. It can be revisable. The difference lies not in structures alone, but in habits of thought. Do people ask why rules exist? Do they notice when exceptions become norms? Do they distinguish between stability and stagnation? These questions do not undermine civilization, they preserve it. Civilizations collapse not when obedience weakens, but when obedience outlives justification, when systems demand alignment without meaning, when power accumulates without accountability, when silence becomes easier than speech, even internally. The future will test this balance relentlessly. Technology will amplify coordination. Crises will demand rapid compliance.
Fear will justify urgency. In such moments, obedience will feel necessary. It may be, but necessity should never become habit without reflection. History's quiet warning is this: every system that claimed permanence believed itself rational. Every hierarchy that endured believed itself necessary. Every form of obedience that became oppressive began as adaptive. What matters is not the presence of obedience, but its relationship to conscience. When conscience is active, obedience can support flourishing. When conscience is dormant, obedience enables harm. The future will be decided not by whether people obey, it will be decided by whether they remain awake while doing so. And that vigilance, fragile, uneven, exhausting, remains the most reliable safeguard civilization has ever produced. Not certainty, not power, not belief, but awareness.